What would happen if one day, after a lifetime of sacrifice and patience, you realized no one really saw you anymore? Not your son, not the grandchild you once cradled in your arms, not the woman who used to call you mom. Then what would you do? Stay and keep being taken for granted, or leave, and for once in your life, choose yourself? This is not just a story. This is a quiet rebellion, a journey to reclaim a name, a place, and a self-respect worn down by years of silent giving. And if any of that touches something in your heart, stay until the end of this story. You might just find the strength you thought you had lost. But before we begin, go ahead and hit subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be heard. Who knows, maybe this one is exactly what you, or someone out there, needs more than anything else right now. My name is Margaret Evelyn. I turned 67 just last month, and honestly, if you happened to see me at the grocery store or in a park somewhere, you probably would not remember my face. I do not stand out. I do not make an impression. I am the kind of woman who wears a classic knit cardigan, low-heeled shoes, and offers a soft smile when someone asks for directions. I used to think that was peace, but now I know. It was a slow disappearance. I had dreams once. Who didn't? I loved books, poetry, and literature the way some people love morning light. When I was 18, my world smelled like old paper and half-finished manuscripts. I wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to stand in a classroom and spark something inside growing minds. But then life, that fancy word for the roads we never meant to take, pulled me off campus. I fell in love. I got married. I got pregnant while my friends were still cramming for finals. I told myself, it's okay. Just press pause on the dream, just for a few years. When the baby's older, I'll come back to it. But those few years became 5, then 10, then 20. Ryan grew up and married Heather. I became a grandmother before I ever finished my first journal. I do not blame them. I truly do not. My son never asked me to sacrifice. Heather never demanded that I cook, clean, or babysit. They just quietly accepted it, like the way you get used to an old chair in the house, always there, always ready. No one ever stops to ask if the chair hurts from being sat on too often. That is how I lived, gently, patiently, devotedly, but also fading. Every morning I woke up early, made coffee for the whole house, folded the napkins into crane shapes, placed the toast just the way Noah liked. I never sat at the table with them. I waited in the kitchen until the kids finished eating, then cleaned up. I was never called by name in family photos. I was the one taking the pictures. I tried to change, once. I signed up for a watercolor painting class downtown, but by the 3rd session, Heather asked if I could pick up Noah. She was busy. By the 4th, Ryan said, "Why are you always out in the evenings? No one's cooking anymore." So I quit the class. No one asked why. I started forgetting what my own voice sounded like. When I spoke, it felt like my words came from the bottom of a well. Light, empty, far away. And then, that day happened. It was Noah's birthday. I baked a cake, hung up streamers, bought paper hats, roasted chicken, made baked potatoes, and cooked chocolate pudding, his favorite. I had been in the kitchen since early morning. No one came in to ask if I was tired. No one said thank you. When I brought the cake out, the whole family was already taking pictures. No one asked me to join the shot. No one reached out to pull me in. I turned back into the kitchen and tried to smile. I made hot cocoa for Noah, just like always. But the moment I handed it to him, he yanked the cup from me, and the steaming drink spilled all over my chest. I stumbled back, hitting my back against the cabinet. The pain cut through like a blade. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stood there, frozen, and watched Heather rush over to hug Noah, not me. "He's just scared, Mom," she said, her voice sharp, like I had somehow caused his panic. Ryan looked up from his phone and said from across the room, "Mom, don't make a big deal out of it. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, holding a bag of ice to the burn on my chest. I opened the cupboard beneath the sink, the place where I kept a file with my name on it. Margaret Evelyn, the legal owner of this house. For the first time in years, I saw my own name again. Not Ryan's mum, not Noah's grandma, not the woman in the kitchen. I was Margaret, and I decided it was time to begin again. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning. There were no hurried footsteps, no smell of toast, no clinking spoons against porcelain cups. Everything in that house was still familiar. But that morning, none of it felt like mine anymore. I made myself a cup of ginger tea, partly to soothe the burn, partly to keep my hands from shaking. The tea was bitter. I did not add honey. I wanted to remember this taste. The taste of resolution, of goodbye left unspoken. I opened my closet and took out the old suitcase I had carried on my honeymoon 40 years ago. It still smelled faintly of dried lavender, tucked into the lining. I packed a few sweaters I loved, a notebook of recipes, a few old photos that had never made it into a frame. I did not need much. Just the things that were still mine. I wrote a small note, not a letter, just a few lines, so I would not disappear entirely. Ryan, I am okay. I need to rest for a while. Do not come looking for me. This house is still mine, but you can stay if you want. I just need a different place, a small one to breathe. I placed the note next to the microwave, where Heather would see it when she made coffee. I did not lock the door. No one locks the door when they leave a place they once called home. On the walk to the bus stop, I did not bring my phone, just my bank card, some cash, and a photocopy of the house deed. The cold wind brushed against my face. For the first time in a long time, I felt my skin truly feel. Not the sting of boiling liquid, but the sharpness of reality. I went to Lorraine's house, an old friend who used to live near me back when we were on Magnolia Street. She opened the door just as I raised my hand to knock. "Margaret?" Her voice sounded surprised, but not rushed. "Can I stay here for a while?" I asked, my eyes not quite meeting hers. She simply stepped aside. "Come in. You always have a place here." That night, I lay on a small single bed, under a thin blanket, with the window cracked open just enough to hear the wind. I did not cry. I did not feel sorry. I just breathed, and it felt like I had stepped out of a dark room that had not been opened in years. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, but that night, I knew one thing. I had left. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but because finally, I knew I deserved a life, not just a supporting role in someone else's. The first morning at Lorraine's house came like a blank sheet of paper. No one knocked on the door, no alarm clock, no sound of slippers scraping the tile floor or dishes clinking in the kitchen. Just soft sunlight coming through the thin curtains and the gentle scent of old wood in the air. I sat up and wrapped myself in the wool scarf Lorraine had left at the foot of the bed. It was soft, warm. Not because of the fabric, but because, for the first time, I knew no one was waiting for me in the kitchen. No one needed me to get things ready. I only needed to show up. For myself. Lorraine is a strange kind of woman, in the gentlest way. She did not ask how long I would stay. She did not look at me with curiosity or pity. She simply said, "You can stay, for as long as you need to feel ready to leave." Just one sentence, but it opened up a space I never thought I would have. I started again, with the smallest things, making tea just for myself, opening the window to let in the morning breeze, walking to the used bookstore on the corner, the one I had passed 20 years ago but never bought anything from because it was not convenient. This time I came home with a new notebook, light brown leather cover, thick pages that smelled faintly of ink. I wrote the first few lines on a drizzly afternoon. I am still alive, not living to serve, not living to prove anything. Just living as a regular person, allowed to breathe deeply, sit still, and hear her own heartbeat. Every day I wrote a little, not much. Some days just a few lines about the tiny cactus outside the window. Other days a memory from childhood, like the time I ran barefoot across my grandmother's backyard, holding a sweet roll that crumbled in my hands. Writing made me come alive again, not like before, but as a version of me that had never existed. A woman finally being heard, by herself. After a week, Lorraine left a small note on the dining table. It was a flyer for a creative writing class for older adults at the town library. "You should give it a try," she said. "Not to be great, just to tell your story. What you carry inside should not be kept to yourself forever." I held the flyer in my hands and felt them tremble, but it was not out of fear. It was because I knew the next chapter of my life had just begun. I went to the writing class on a chilly Wednesday morning. Dry leaves curled around my feet as I stepped through the gate of the old library. The classroom was on the second floor, with a large window overlooking a park where children swung beneath trees turning red and gold. There were 8 of us in the class, all older. One had been an accountant, one a nurse, another a gardener. None of us looked alike, but we all carried stories that had never been told. The instructor, Lila, was decades younger than me. Her voice was calm, like flowing water. "There's no right way to write, only what's real," she said in our first session. I sat in the back corner, gripping my pen, my heart pounding like a knock on a long-sealed door. She asked us to write about a time we felt forgotten. I hesitated, but then I wrote. I wrote about my grandson's birthday, the hot cocoa that burned me, and how no one asked if I was okay. I did not write it beautifully. I did not use technique. I just told the truth, raw, painful, but real. When I read it aloud at the end of the class, the room went quiet. No one interrupted. No one offered pity. Just a slow nod from a silver-haired man sitting across from me, and tear-filled eyes from an older woman named Joan, who had lost her daughter in a car accident and had never spoken of it to anyone in 10 years. Lila said softly, "Sometimes words do not heal right away, but they let you look at your wound and say, 'I see you. I'm still here.'" From that day on, I wrote more regularly, not just for the class, but for myself. I started printing short pieces and sending them to local magazines. One of them published my work, a piece titled "The Woman Behind the Door." I do not know if anyone read it, but Lorraine brought the newspaper home, placed it on the table like a gift, and said, her eyes bright like morning light, "You're not invisible anymore, Margaret. People are starting to see you now." 3 days after The Woman Behind the Door was published, I received a letter, not an email, not a text, a real letter, handwritten in neat purple ink, inside an ivory-colored envelope with slanted cursive, to Mrs. Margaret Evelyn. I opened it with both hands, as if it held something fragile that needed to be protected. It was from a woman named Clarice in another state. She wrote, "I did not know who you were until I read your story, but I saw myself in it. I also lived in my son's house. I also stood quietly in the kitchen, folding napkins, boiling water, cooking dinners, and also had no seat at the family table. Thank you for saying what so many of us never had the courage to voice." I folded the letter and held it to my chest, not because I was happy, but because I felt seen, across hundreds of miles. Clarice was the first. Then more letters arrived. One from a man in Idaho who said he always thought his mother was just shy until he read my story. One from an elderly woman in Maine who sent me a copy of a poem she wrote in 1973 and never dared show anyone. I no longer wrote just for myself. I wrote for all the people who had once lived behind closed doors, and now they were starting to open those doors, one by one. Lorraine suggested I host a small gathering at her home. Nothing formal, no stage, just a circle of chairs, a pot of tea, and stories shared in the warmth of listening eyes. That evening, 8 people showed up, 7 women, 1 man, a widower, holding an old wedding photo he always kept in his wallet. I told my story again. Clarice, the writer of that first letter, was there too. She had flown in. We hugged like we had known each other forever. One by one, they began to share. No one interrupted. No one rushed. Some cried. Some just quietly placed a hand on the one next to them. But every single person left with a different look in their eyes, like they had reclaimed something they once believed was lost. That night, as I washed the teacups, I looked down at my hands under the warm stream of water. They were still wrinkled, still bore the old burn, but I had never seen them look so beautiful. I sat by the window, the late autumn sun casting a soft light on the hand holding my pen. In front of me was a blank sheet of paper and a sentence I had never dared to write. A letter to the woman I used to be. Not to Clarice, not to Joan or Linda, but to Margaret Evelyn, the woman of quiet years, of heavy burdens, of fading into the background under the label of devotion. To Margaret, if you are reading this letter, maybe you have started to question the role the world handed to you. Maybe you are beginning to wonder why the meals were always hot, but the eyes at the table so cold. Maybe you have noticed that you are always the last to go to bed, but never the first to be called in family pictures. You think you are small. You think you were born to help others have a better life, but who said you are not just as worthy of having a good life yourself? You do not need anyone's permission to dream, to rest, to be silent, or to be angry. You were born with that right. And if someone made you forget it, then it is time to remember. You may have spent years living as a shadow, but it only takes one moment of standing up and saying, I am a person too, I deserve to be seen. And you have stepped into the light. No permission needed, no guide required. Keep writing, Margaret. Tell every story that ever made you hurt. Then tell the ones that make you proud. You are not invisible. You never were. I signed my name in clear, steady handwriting, Margaret Evelyn. The woman who stepped out of the kitchen and never returned the same. I folded the letter, not to mail it, but to read it aloud at next week's writing class. When I finished reading it, no one said a word. But Lila walked over, placed her hand on my shoulder, and said, Today you did not just write for yourself. You spoke for many who need to be called by their names. That night, I taped the letter to my bedroom mirror. Every morning when I wake up, I look at it. Not as a reminder, but as proof. I truly came home to myself. The following month passed slowly, like the pages of an old book. I did not return to my old house, but I did not cut off ties completely. Ryan sent a few messages, short ones just checking in. Heather stayed silent. And Noah, the boy, still sent New Year cards with scribbled drawings. I kept them all in a small wooden box under my bed. I was not angry, but I was not ready to return as before. And maybe I never would. I began helping Lorraine at the town library. No pay, no formal arrangement, just shelving books, wiping tables, brewing tea for the elderly who came every Friday afternoon. There, I was not the babysitter or the one in the kitchen. I was Margaret, the storyteller, the woman who laughed easily, the one who tucked little notes of encouragement into page 73 of random books. One day, Lila, my writing instructor, invited me to speak at a small event about women and writing in later life. I almost declined, but Lorraine said, "If not you, then who?" I stood on a small wooden stage, holding a printed copy of the letter I wrote to myself. In front of me were nearly 40 people, all ages. I did not read from a manuscript. I told a story about a woman who had no seat at the dinner party she prepared, about a burn, about a suitcase, about the first letter from Clarice, about the mirror with the taped-up letter in her bedroom. At the end, some came up to hug me. Some just held my hand and whispered, "Thank you." A girl in her 20s handed me a small notebook and said, You're the reason I started writing. I did not know whether to laugh or cry. But I knew I was standing in the right place. I did not need to lead. I did not need a spotlight. I only needed a place, just big enough so I would not be hidden or forgotten. A small place in a big world. And for the first time, I saw that the world had space for me. I do not know what exactly marks the end of a chapter. Some say it is when forgiveness happens. Some wait until the past is fixed. But for me, I think a chapter ends when you stop running and finally stand still with yourself. I decided to rent a small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building near the town center. It had a window facing the lake, a tiny kitchen, and a balcony just big enough for 4 herb pots. Lorraine helped me move in. No tears, no grand farewell. We just played music and unpacked, like it was the start of a vacation. I kept only what truly mattered: my writing notebooks, the old wool scarf, my tea set, Clarice's letter, Noah's cards, and the mirror with the letter I wrote to myself. Everything else, I let go, gently, like taking off a coat that no longer fits. I no longer taught writing. I no longer spoke in public. Most of my days were spent reading, watering plants, and walking around the lake. Every morning, I sat on the balcony, tea in hand, wanting nothing more than quiet. One April afternoon, I received a letter from Ryan. It said, "I'm sorry I never truly saw you, Mum. I thought you were always okay, but now I understand. Silence does not mean no pain. If you're ready, I'd love to have dinner with you. Not to bring you back, just to listen." I did not answer right away. I brewed a pot of tea, opened the window, and watched sunlight dance on the lake's surface. I felt no anger, no expectations. Only one thing remained: freedom. I did not know if that dinner would happen, and if it did, I knew I did not need it to close anything. Because I had already learned the most important truth. Freedom is not about leaving everything behind. Freedom is when you can choose to return, or not, and still feel at peace. I wrote the final line in my 3rd notebook and closed it with a smile. 67 years old, starting over, not to redo life, but to live it fully, as myself. I took a deep breath. There was nothing left to prove, no one to wait for, no one left behind. I was still here, free. That spring arrived late, but I was no longer impatient like I used to be. Every morning I sat on the balcony, quietly watching the tiny buds slowly push through the soil in my white chrysanthemum pot. I had planted it the day I moved into this apartment. I was not hoping for it to bloom, only for it to live. Lorraine still visited every week. She brought apple pie or an old book. We sat together without needing to say much. Sometimes someone's presence is fuller than any conversation. One afternoon, she looked at me and said, "Margaret, your flowers have bloomed." I turned to the white chrysanthemums. They were not dazzling, not perfect. Some petals were still curled and wrinkled, but they were flowers, and they had lived. I gently touched a thin petal. Something inside me, light as the scent of wet earth after rain, broke open, not from sadness, but because I knew I was blooming again too, slowly, quietly, but truly. I did not know why I accepted Ryan's dinner invitation. Maybe because the letter felt sincere, maybe because I had grown strong enough to return without being swallowed, but deep in my heart I knew I was not going back to make peace. I was going back to close something unfinished on my own terms. I chose a light blue dress, old-fashioned, modest, and well-fitted. The silk scarf I had worn the first time I moved in with Lorraine now rested gently around my neck, not for beauty, but as armor. On the way there, I bought a small bouquet. White chrysanthemums, the kind that survives even when no one fusses over it. The house looked the same. Noah's bike still leaned on the porch. Heather's shoes still crooked at the front door. I stood there for a long time, not afraid, not emotional, just like a guest returning to a place once left. Heather opened the door. She looked at me with an expression I could not explain. "Hi, Mum," she said. I nodded. No hug, no smile, but no coldness either. Ryan was slicing salad in the kitchen. There was an awkwardness in how he held the knife. I sat down, in a chair I used to only stand beside, serving everyone else. Now I sat. On the table was a new set of utensils, neatly folded napkins, a vase of white chrysanthemums. Maybe it was a coincidence, but I acknowledged it. The dinner was quiet, not the kind of silence that feels tense, the kind that feels accepting. Ryan passed me the vegetables. Heather poured the water. Noah sat next to me, occasionally glancing up and smiling. No one brought up the past. No one explained anything. But every little act seemed to whisper, "We know we forgot you." I did not say I forgave them. I did not need an apology. We simply ate, for the first time, as equals at the table. No roles, no burdens, no expectations. And I realized, sometimes, kind silence is the most beautiful form of remorse. After the meal, Noah pressed a piece of paper into my hand, a drawing, of a woman standing in a flower garden. I laughed. "What's Grandma doing here?" "Planting herself again," Noah said. I did not cry, but something very soft moved through my chest. Its name was letting go. I stood up, kissed my grandson gently on the forehead. I made no promises to return. But this time, when I left that house, I did not carry the pain with me. I only carried the drawing and the bouquet of white chrysanthemums, still intact. A week after that dinner, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated a little before picking up. "Mrs. Margaret?" A young woman's voice, slightly trembling. "My name is Emily. I'm a senior majoring in sociology. I'm working on my thesis about the invisible role of elderly women in modern families. I read your piece. It changed the way I see my grandmother." I was quiet for a few seconds, not used to being someone who changed perspectives. "I'd love to interview you, if you're willing," she said. I agreed to meet her on Saturday morning at a small cafe by the lake, the one that served the best ginger scones in town. Emily arrived with her hair tied high, thick glasses, and a notebook full of scribbles. She did not ask questions like a hurried reporter. She asked like a granddaughter, truly wanting to understand. "Why didn't you speak up during all those years?" she asked gently. I looked at my steaming cup of tea, then answered slowly, "Because if I had spoken up every time I was hurt, I was afraid I'd become a burden, so I stayed quiet, until there was nothing left I could swallow." Emily nodded, writing quickly. Then she paused and said, "You know, my grandmother was a teacher before she retired, but after that, no one ever mentioned her name in the house. I just remember her staring out the window, still as a statue." I asked, "How is she now?" Emily looked down. "She passed away last year. No one knew she had written poetry, until I found a box of papers under her bed." I reached out and held her hand. No words were needed, just to let her know. I understood. The following week, Emily sent me the draft of her thesis. She dedicated the final section to quoting parts of my writing, but what moved me the most was her dedication page, to my grandmother and to all the women who were ever forgotten in their own homes. 2 weeks later, Emily called again. She wanted to organize a community dialogue between students and retired women. I said yes, not to retell my wounds, but to open a conversation, so the younger ones would not have to guess, and the elders would not have to hide. The event took place on a sunny Sunday afternoon. I stood before more than 60 people, both young and old. I told the story of the first time I left home, without sadness. of the way my grandson looked at me and said, "Grandma is planting herself again." And I told the younger ones, do not wait for the elders to speak up. Learn to look and ask, because sometimes the right question at the right time can save a quiet life. As I stepped down, Emily hugged me tightly and whispered, "I think my grandmother heard this, and I believe she's smiling." I believe that too. I used to avoid mirrors in the morning, not because I feared wrinkles or silver hair, but because I feared seeing a stranger, someone who had lived too long, trying to please everyone except herself. But this morning, I stood before the mirror, back straight, silver hair falling gently over my shoulders. The mirror reflected a face with soft hollows in the cheeks, crow's feet at the corners of the eyes, but a gaze steady as an old branch that had weathered many storms. I looked closely into my own eyes and said aloud, "I see you now. No one else. Just me." The woman once pushed out of the family photo frame. The one who let others decide the course of her life. The one who always spoke softly, even when her heart was breaking. I placed my hand on the mirror, as if comforting the version of myself from those quiet, heavy years. "It's okay, you're home now." That day, I began writing a new story. Not a journal entry, not an article, just a draft. Unpolished, without any plan for it to become a book. But for the first time, I wrote not because I wanted someone to read it. I wrote because I owed myself a life fully told, completely and honestly. I wrote about a 67-year-old woman walking in spring rain to buy chamomile tea, about an afternoon spent arranging flowers, playing classical music, and ignoring the ringing phone because I'm spending time with me. I wrote about a moment she texted an old friend, "Want noodles? My treat." And I wrote about the nights when she sat by the window, under a soft yellow light, reading old books without fearing loneliness. Because now, solitude was no longer punishment. It was freedom. I do not know how long I have left to live, but I know that each day I have, I will live it as the woman I saw in the mirror this morning, with age, with lines, with old sadness, but with light. No one taught me how to grow old happily. I had to learn it myself. And today, I passed the first lesson. A message arrived one quiet afternoon. "Margaret, would you like to join a support group for older women? A few members of the community want to hear your story." I read that line again and again before setting the phone down, not because I was uncertain, but because I knew. This was no longer a question of courage. It was a question of whether I wanted to keep sowing what had already begun to grow. The gathering took place in a small room at the community center. Old wooden floors, pale blue curtains, and a whiteboard with the words scribbled across it. "It is never too late to begin." I arrived early. There were white chrysanthemums on the table. This time I knew. It was not a coincidence. Women came from all over. Widows, women who had lived with their children, women who had divorced, women who had never married. They sat in a circle, hands wrapped around warm teacups, eyes nervous but hopeful. I remembered once having that look too. I began with a simple question. When was the last time someone asked you, "What do you need?" The room fell silent, then one hand went up. "I don't remember." Another voice said, "I used to think I wasn't supposed to need anything." I told them my story, not in detail, not with tears, but with truth. Then, one by one, they began to share. One spoke about being pushed aside when her daughter-in-law moved in. Another shared how she slept on the couch because the bedroom was now her grandson's. Someone else said she once forgot her own birthday, too busy baking for everyone else's. We were not trying to fix everything. We were simply listening. And sometimes that is the only thing that matters. At the end, a woman in her 70s walked up to me, her hands trembling as she placed one gently on my shoulder. "Margaret," she said, "thank you for creating a place where I do not have to explain why I exist." I did not respond. I simply laid my hand over hers and smiled. Inside, a clear voice rang out in my chest. "Margaret, there is a place for you here. Not because you do anything, but because you deserve it. On the walk home, I walked slowly. Dry leaves crunched beneath my feet, and in the reflection of an old bookstore window, I saw the silhouette of an elderly woman, shoulders upright, walking without hesitation, no longer avoiding, no longer asking for permission. Just Margaret. And she finally had a place in this world, not because someone gave it to her, but because she claimed it.